In 2019, Full Funnel decided that we were going to get into the staffing business, and the primary reason was that I was seeing all of these companies that were doing staffing, and they were getting quite large. One of which was a Boston area based company that when I first noticed them, they were smaller than my company, and then when I looked up again, they were like 3 times the size and headcount of my company, and I was like, oh wow, that's really interesting. How is that happening? And it was primarily like an SDR staffing model. I was like, okay, that's interesting. We had always dabbled in outbound. We had always done sort of demand gen program work, but we had never actually staffed people on those accounts. And so we actually did launch a staffing business in 2020, and it took off like a rocket ship. It became an 8-figure business line in the course of like 12 months. And the reality of that business line is I learned so much about how organizations look at labor and outbound demand gen, and the results were horrifying. The reality is that most organizations just have absolutely no respect for the labor, the outbound, the process, and they really are just out there looking for people, usually young people, to pull magic rabbits out of magic hats. One of the things about that is after like 3 or 4 years in that business, I started really thinking about like, what is that role and how does that work for outbound agencies? And I started thinking about the statistics behind it. And I wanted to share those with you. According to the research that I've done at the time that this was published, there was roughly about 600,000 SDRs active in the United States. I went around and I looked at all of the competitors, the N3s, which are acquired by Accenture, Memory Blues, the Operatics, the Jump Crews, the Reveneers, the Aquarians, like all of these companies that are in this sort of SDR staffing business. And I came to the conclusion that there was about maybe 15,000 at best outsourced SDRs out there in the market that I could actually find. And so, and I couldn't find 15,000. I think I could find about 10,000, and I just added 5 to it because I was like, I must be missing some. And so I sat there and I was like, all right, 15,000 SDRs are outsourced, but there are 600,000 SDRs total. That only represents about 2.5% of the market. So then I started thinking like, companies don't outsource SDRs. They don't outsource sales usually. That's not what they want to do. The market for sales outsourcing, SDR staffing specifically, is only actually capturing about 2.5% market share on the SDR position. The other 97% or 97.5% of the market is either doing recruiting firms to acquire their SDRs or running their own recruiting, hiring, training, and ramping programs. And I thought that was a very interesting sort of data point because it started to sort of make the case for me, which is like outsource SDR staffing, never mind the fact that it's probably not a great business to be in because the SDR role is going to be so different as we move forward into an age of globalization, AI, and consolidation of the process generally. I sort of looked at it and I was like, wow, that is super interesting that 97% of the market will not outsource that function. But what an interesting market opportunity because through our travels in that space, we've worked with Fortune 500 companies, we've worked with startups, we've worked with everyone in between. I didn't find one company from publicly traded companies to startups that actually understood that position. They really just had money to spend and they wanted things to happen and they didn't really care about the sort of connective tissue in between those two things. So for those of you out there who are in the sales agency space, who are in this sort of services space, not only do I think the SDR model is dying and sort of it's certainly not going to be where it is, but also 97% of the market isn't outsourcing that position. And further from that, they're using recruiting firms, which offer no value except placement, as well as their own internal groups that, as I've said, I've just never run across. And maybe it's the slice of the market that we've interacted with. No one has an idea of how these business units should be run. They're so financially inefficient. They're so operationally inefficient. It's been very, very interesting. And it's part of my journey as an entrepreneur to see stuff like this. What have you seen?